Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at my top 100 video games of all time, my personal favorites. Not necessarily what I think are the 100 best, but my top 100 favorite. And I wanted to do this partially for my own curiosity, but also because over the past few years, my wife finally convinced me to play through the entire Yakuza Like a Dragon franchise. And that, more than any other series I've ever played, completely shook up what my top 100 games were at the time before I started that journey. It completely shifted things around, kicked a bunch of games off my top 100. Just an incredible effect that it had. I love that series. And speaking of which, starting with number 100, we have Yakuza Dead Souls on the PS3. Starting off with a perfect example of why it's my favorite games, not games that I consider to be, the best ever made necessarily, because this game has a lot of problems. It has tons of camera control issues, just glitches and problems throughout the entire experience that I had with the game. But it was so much fun. It was over-the-top comedic and just a blast to play. I think partially being such a fan of these characters and this universe, that playing this zombie shooter, which is not something I would typically play to begin with that style of humor and these characters and the settings they were in, made me enjoy it despite the very obvious flaws in playing. It was just so much fun that it instantly became one of my favorite games, easily beating out 400 or 500, who knows how many over the many years, games that I've played, beating out some lifetime favorites, just because I found so much joy in the experience despite all the issues. Number 99, Eternal Ring on the PS2. The Dark Souls and Demon Souls and all those games are huge now. I was more of a fan of From Software with the older Kingsfield games on the PS1 and the PS2 and the PC. That was more my style. That's where those games came from. All the Dark Souls games, they're kind of a continuation of that. And Eternal Ring was a spin-off to that, and it was definitely not one of the best in that series. I think Kingsfield 4, The Ancient City, is probably the best in that series. But at the time, it was something that really attached to my favorite time in all of video games, is that 2000/2001 era. The launch of the PlayStation 2 was my favorite launch of a console ever, and had this indelible mark upon my early teenage years, that a lot of games that I played within that time frame are still on this list. A few have been knocked off over the years, but there's a bunch in that time frame that I just have such fond memories of. That Eternal Ring is one of those, the first RPG that I played on the PlayStation 2. It was one of the first 5 games that I owned for that console. And having just those few games and being so excited for the PlayStation 2, I really dug into it like crazy. And then after this, went on to play Summoner and Evergrace and things like that, but didn't have quite the effect that Eternal Ring did, as being something that was my first kind of next-gen RPG experience, so it really stuck with me over the years. Number 98, Tomb Raider on the PS1. I've always had a bit of a love-hate relationship with this first Tomb Raider. I'm really excited to check out the remaster when it is physically released about a month after I record this. Because as a big fan of movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark, and as a big Indiana Jones kid, even more than a Star Wars kid, I loved the idea of Tomb Raider and Lara Croft, and I have always enjoyed the game and the setting and loved it. But even from the first time I played it, for some reason the first Tomb Raider I had the most issues with the controls. I found it to be very difficult over the years. But at the same time, I always just, when I played through it, would fight my way through those issues I was having, because I loved it and enjoyed it so much, and it was something that was just right up a certain alley of game that I was wanting to play, and is an all-time classic. Another early PS1 game, number 97, we have Wild Arms, one of the first RPGs I played on the original PlayStation, and it was so different. I loved the combination of the fantasy with a little bit of the Wild West vibes. And I played a bunch of the Wild Arms games over the years, but nothing had quite the same effect as that first Wild Arms, especially from just the opening sequence alone. Just drew me in immediately into the experience, and I loved it as something that had this combination of being familiar, yet having its own twist to that familiar kind of RPG style, and was one that has always stuck with me. Something that is very different, very unfamiliar feeling, was number 96, Vagrant Story, a Squaresoft classic for the PS1. Even to this day, from the art style to the tone kind of fitting in with the other Ivalice type stuff, but everything about it still to this day feels like a very unique experience. And one that I hope that Square Enix now re-releases in some form, in a collection or a remaster or something, because I feel like more people should experience, because it is very unique and is one of those classics that I feel never had quite enough mainstream appeal to where it seems to be a little lost to time. Number 95, Parasite Eve 2, another Squaresoft classic for the PS1. Never liked it quite as much as the first because of the radical changes to the gameplay style. They saw the success of the Resident Evil games and changed it to function a little more like them, and I was always disappointed with that change, but at the same time, I loved the main character, and I found the setting to be very unique. It had a lot of horror vibes, but a lot of it took place in bright, sunlit desert type settings, so something a little different. It's something that felt fairly unique at the time, even though they had restructured the controls to feel more like the survival horror of the era, which I found disappointing. I still loved everything else about the experience. It was kind of like Tomb Raider, where there was an issue that I had with it, but I loved everything about it, aside from that issue, so much that I always powered through, and it has remained one of my favorite games of all time over these many years because of those other elements. Moving on to number 94, sadly, the only game left in my top 100 now for my first console, the NES, the original Final Fantasy. It's so interesting to think about how many NES games used to be in my top 100, and this is the one that remains. This is my first experience with the Final Fantasy series, which for many years was my all-time favorite franchise. Now it's in my top 3, and this was one of the first experiences I ever had with this style of game too. The JRPG, the turn-based combat. I was much more of a PC and Mac gamer at the time, more into strategy games, the RTS type stuff in the early days, and point-and-click adventure. So this was dipping my toes in the water of what would become my absolute favorite genre of game to play for the rest of my life. So it's a very important game for me, and still just a great classic that I have a lot of good childhood memories with. Number 93, a PC classic, the original Diablo for PC and Mac. While I've enjoyed some of the later Diablo games, nothing really had quite the same appeal for me as that first one. It felt so unique at the time, and I can just hear, even talking about it, the background music, especially in the town, I can hear it in the back of my mind, because everything about that original Diablo, for some reason, feels very iconic to me, and still remains one of my favorite PC experiences from the 90s. Moving on to number 92, we have Warcraft Orcs and Humans. While the formula would be refined for Warcraft 2 and then eventually StarCraft, Warcraft Orcs and Humans is still a fantastic fantasy strategy game from the early days of Blizzard on the PC, and I played this game obsessively, staying up late nights past my bedtime, sneaking down to the sound off, playing it when I was in elementary school for a little bit, because I was so enthralled with the entire experience. No pun intended. And number 91, a game that, man, I wish would get a remaster, because it was just shy of being brilliant, but it never will. We have Star Trek Deep Space Nine, The Fallen. Star Trek games tend to be hit or miss, and they tend to be a little better when they're more story-oriented, less action-focused, but The Fallen, I think, fell into the little more action side, while still giving an experience that really felt like a genuinely cool Deep Space Nine episode, and really captured the setting well. And with how much I love Star Trek and DS9 specifically, that was a game that I instantly fell in love with, but not quite as much as the, honestly, probably worst game, number 90, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Harbinger. One of the first games that I ever bought with my own money as a kid, this truly felt like a playable episode of early DS9. And while the second half of the game has a lot of problems, the overall experience, again, being a kid and watching Deep Space Nine as it was airing, and then being able to get on the computer and play in that world with these characters and explore parts of the station. I could just hear the background hum, and it was such a mind-blowing experience. I couldn't believe that I was clicking around. It's just like a few screens, really, but that I was moving through the promenade at night, or going up to Ops and talking to Dax, and it was an amazing experience. Even though it's a heavily flawed game, it's something that I can't shake the memories of that, and I think it'll always be one of my favorites because of the time that it came out. Number 89, Tales of Legendia for the PS2. An interesting game that was made by the Soul Calibur team. I think Tales of Legendia has one of my favorite kind of color palettes, I want to say, for a Tales game. I really feel like artistically it was very well done, and it's easily my favorite soundtrack in a Tales game for sure. And the fighting, of course, was very well crafted. I think the problem that Tales of Legendia has is that a lot of things, when it comes together, exploring the overworld, the kind of chibi look to the characters doesn't quite fit the setting. Like, everything about it feels like it was built by a team with a vision, but without the real experience of creating something within that genre. It always felt kind of unfinished, undercooked, but the elements that shine in it shine so brightly that it has always remained one of my favorites in that series. Number 88, Tales of Symphonia. Specifically, the GameCube version, I think, is the overall best one, and that's kind of how I originally played it. Honestly, over the years, the story isn't the strongest and the characters, but I have such great memories with it, and it is still, I think, one of the most fun Tales games to play, just for me, in revisiting it, even though from a narrative structure and from the characters, it's not quite one of my favorites. I still have a very fond attachment to them from playing that when it first came out, and being that it was an RPG on the GameCube, something just was not a strong suit of that console overall compared to something like the PS2. It felt very unique at the time. Then Tales of Vesperia, which I loved on the 360, but I have to go the Switch version overall with the added stuff from the Japanese PS3 version. This, to me, as far as the fun replayability elements, is right around the area of Symphonia, but I do prefer overall the characters and the story, and that's why it kind of narrowly beats it out. Those two are pretty close. Number 86, a game I can't believe failed sales-wise twice. It's so unique and interesting. We have Tokyo Mirage Sessions Sharp FE. Specifically the Wii U version. The Switch version is fine. I just like the way the Wii U version functions. A lot of games originally on the Wii U, I feel that way. The promised Shin Megami Tensei and Fire Emblem crossover game that, when it was finally released, looked nothing like what was seemingly originally pitched and what people were anticipating. And I feel like that's why it probably didn't do well, but it was an interesting fusion. It felt closer to a Fire Emblem and Persona crossover game rather than more, mainline SMT. But I think it took a lot of the best of those series and made its own vibrant, colorful, unique, fun RPG experience, and it's genuinely one of the best battle systems I've ever played as far as just being fun to go through the combat element of the game. It honestly, in that regard, beats out the best of Persona for me. Even Persona 4 or 5, from that portion, the actual play through anything related to the combat element of the game, I think it's superior. It had really interesting dungeon designs. It is a little odd being super vibrant and colorful and falling into the realm of pop idols and stuff. I could see why it might seem on the outside a little off-putting, for some people, but if you really give it a chance, there's something grand there, and they do some really cool things with those elements that I wish, it's something that I wish had been more successful to see another one, because I think it was very well made and instantly became a favorite of mine. Number 85, Sakura Wars on the PlayStation 4. Switching from the more familiar strategic combat element of this series to something that felt a little more action-oriented, I was a little uncertain going in, but they did it beautifully. I loved the way this worked out. And finally getting, only for the second time, a game in the series here in the West in English, I was very excited. Another game that I wish had been more successful because it needs sequels. I'd love for them to use this style and game engine to remake some of the older games that were Japan only for the Saturn and Dreamcast. Having played a lot of those older ones through translation guides and stuff and kind of struggling through, it was fun to finally just be able to play through one without that added barrier, and I thought was superior to the one that we did get on the Wii that I did find enjoyable. There's only one other game in that series that I like a little bit more. We have number 84, Sakura Wars 3 on the Dreamcast. There's something with the characters and the Paris setting that I feel makes this one stand out a bit compared to 1 and 2, and then the brief, 4, and then 5, of course, with the New York setting is really cool, but this, I think, takes the very classic Sakura Wars formula and does it best. I think this is sort of the pinnacle of that classic era of the series. And I'd love to see even just that original 1, 2, and 3 come out in a new collection. That would be incredible. Number 83, we have Tomb Raider 3. This was actually the first Tomb Raider game, kind of, that I ever played. The first Tomb Raider I didn't buy till right after Tomb Raider 3 had released. I found it, on discount or whatever, and that was my first experience of the full game. Tomb Raider 3 I first played at a demo for the PC that just had kind of the opening levels and was pretty short, but I played through that 4 or 5 times because I found it to be so exciting, and that's really why I grabbed the original Tomb Raider when I found a copy. And while I enjoyed the next few games that I then played on the Dreamcast, really I feel like that original trilogy kind of peaked, the series, the original era of the series, peaked with 3 in a sense. But even in saying that, there's something about the settings and story of Tomb Raider 2 that makes it my number 82. My favorite in the original Tomb Raider era for the PS1. Tomb Raider 2 took everything that was great about the original and improved everything about it. I thought the level design was a little more interesting, a little bit better. I felt like the story was a bit more engaging. I felt like the way you control Lara felt a little more fine-tuned. Like, it just took everything and improved it to make an incredible experience. And I never really got into the much newer Tomb Raider games. They never really appealed to me as much as these classics, but one era that I feel like was successful in its time, but since they've redone Tomb Raider again, kind of gets forgotten as this middle chapter when the team behind the Soul Reaver franchise took over for a bit for a few games, and those are actually my favorite games in the entire franchise, starting with 81, Tomb Raider Underworld. And number 80, Tomb Raider Legend, and then my favorite Tomb Raider game of all time, 79, Tomb Raider Anniversary, that I played initially on the PlayStation 2. This was my dream Tomb Raider game. I'd played Legend and Underworld first before getting into Anniversary, and I loved them, and it took everything that made them great and used that to remake the original Tomb Raider, which, as I said before, I loved the experience, but I kind of always fought through some of the parts that I didn't like because I liked those other elements so much, that this took that and perfected everything. It took the best of classic Tomb Raider, the best of what was then the new era of Tomb Raider, and to me made the perfect Tomb Raider game. This is my ideal Tomb Raider experience, Tomb Raider Anniversary. Number 78, still one of my favorite fighting games of all time, Tekken Tag Tournament for the PlayStation 2. I'm a little bit more of a 2D fighting game person than a 3D, but Tekken always stood out to me. Tekken, Soul Calibur, and Bushido Blade were the 3 kind of 3D series that I've always really gravitated towards. And my favorite Tekken is and will always be Tekken Tag Tournament for the PlayStation 2. Again, it was one of those PS2 launch games. I rented it when I first was able to get my hands on a PlayStation 2 and played this endlessly with friends. There's a couple of games that are on this list to come that are from that time period, but Tekken Tag Tournament is easily the fighting game I put more time into playing with friends than any other fighting game ever made over the years. We played that game constantly, probably hundreds of hours, and it's still a game that I come back to all the time. And I remember being, even from, picking up magazines as the PlayStation 2 was coming out, seeing images of Tekken Tag Tournament, being a big fan of Tekken 3, and being blown away by how incredible it looked and how it was basically Tekken 3 with the tag element added in and a huge, very mind-boggling at the time graphical overhaul and the addition of the bowling game, little things that just made it my overall, still to this day, favorite Tekken experience. Haven't played all the modern Tekken games, and even though I've enjoyed them, nothing will hold a candle to the memories I have with Tekken Tag Tournament. Number 77 starts kind of a string here of my all-time favorite first-person shooters. Not a genre that I've always been big into, but I enjoyed things like Half-Life and Unreal Tournament, games that from the PC era of the late 90s, early 2000s. One that has always been a favorite of mine, again because of my love of Star Trek, is Star Trek Voyager Elite Force. Particularly the PS2, which is how I initially played it and was able to play with friends. I took that element of the first-person shooter multiplayer, fun with friends that I liked from stuff like Quake and Unreal, and gave it a Star Trek Voyager look, and added in a Star Trek Voyager, lost episode feeling storyline, and was fantastic. I was, again, just hyped to be able to play a Star Trek game at the time, and be able to get some friends to play as well. And I thought it captured so many of the settings so perfectly, especially that kind of creepy level with the TOS look. I loved that. Everything about the level designs, it really just felt like it captured the spirit of Star Trek and put it in a first-person shooter kind of action-based scenario. And then my favorite FPS games of all time will always be Time Splitters. I really wish that would come back as some kind of collection or something, or Time Splitters 4 or whatever, because they, to me, blow everything away with the fun factor. Starting with Time Splitters 2, my number 76 for the PlayStation 2. Then 75, Time Splitters Future Perfect, which is probably overall the best one, but my favorite is number 74, Time Splitters for the PS2. Again, that was one of those few launch games that we played constantly. I spent more time, building levels and playing with friends and staying up for hours and hours. This is the only game that I ever played where we actually had to turn off the PlayStation 2 because it was overheating and lagging because we had played it all night long and well into the next day. Just unbelievable number of hours in a row. My friends and I at the time, when the first Time Splitters came out, could not get enough of it. And it will always be my favorite in that genre because of that. I still have the very kind of fun arcade feeling. There wasn't really a story structure much yet in the first one. Single player campaign, even that, I have every one of those levels still memorized, even though I probably haven't played them in 10-15 years. Just picked up random matches over time, but man, that is just such an iconic game from that time period, that launch window of the PlayStation 2, and I've never had more fun with a game in that genre. Moving on to 73, Crash Nitro Kart for the PlayStation 2. I'm a big fan of kart racers. I have a huge collection of them. I just find them to be a lot of fun. I like more arcadey racing type stuff more than the Gran Turismo sim type element, and kart racers to me have always been just the most fun, and Crash Nitro Kart was an incredible follow-up to Crash Team Racing. Even though I always felt like it didn't expand upon it quite as much as it could have, it felt more like a remake slash expansion than a true sequel, but I still really loved it, and of course is one of my favorite games of all time, obviously. Being narrowly beat out by another racing game, we have number 72, Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing Transformed, the Wii U version. I felt like this is probably the greatest tribute to the legacy of Sega that they've apparently completely forgotten and aren't going to release Saturn and Dreamcast games the way they've been releasing Genesis games over and over again. I don't get it. This is kind of what, Astrobot is for Sony properties. This is for Sega, and in the form of a fantastic racing game. I genuinely think that this game is better than any of the Mario Karts. As much as, the Mario Kart games are fun, and they're obviously obscenely popular, but I think this edges them out. There's something about this that I really, really enjoyed. The first one was really good, and I liked it, but this took everything to the next level, and exploring those Sega-themed stages, going through Skies of Arcadia, any of those levels, Nights into Dreams, brilliant. And it's one of those games that I really wish we had another one, or that Sega would actually come back and touch some of the franchises that shine so brightly in this brilliant, fun tribute to classic Sega in the form of an amazing racing game. And the last game for part 1, number 71, I don't want to break this up as I know it's going to be a long video, with wanting to actually talk about why my favorite games are my favorite games. We have Like a Dragon 7 for the PlayStation 4, the first game introducing us to Ichiban, with the, I know for a lot of fans, controversial switch to the more traditional JRPG turn-based combat system, but seeing how that is my favorite genre of video game by far, I was excited for that and dove right into it. And I felt like they introduced it in the perfect fashion. I talked about this game a lot before on this channel, but I feel like through the eyes of its main character and his obsession with Dragon Quest and his sort of delusional look at reality, I think that was sold so perfectly in such a charming fashion that it made the switch to the new combat style very fluid and still kept so much of what made the Yakuza games unique, that it really just felt like a genuine next chapter in this saga with a slightly different control scheme, and it still was a lot of fun and action-packed and was improved with the next entry, but not getting there yet. I found it to be a very enjoyable experience. The one thing that I didn't dislike but didn't capture me quite as much as I like the cast, they didn't quite click with me as much as a lot of the characters in previous games. I felt the story fit them perfectly. I think it's one of the better written games in the series, and it's obviously one of my favorite games ever, but it's not quite as high as some of the other games in the franchise for me, just because I didn't connect with those characters quite as strongly as I did others. So that's the end of part 1. We'll go ahead with number 70 in part 2.